Her hands shook as she placed the silver tray on the table. "Wait, that design! It's my father's," the black waitress whispered. The billionaire's smile froze, his fingers stiff. A crystal glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the marble floor. The entire room went silent. Every eye turned toward the young woman in uniform who had just dared to speak. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening and the world needs to hear them. The echo of breaking glass still lingered as she realized what she had said. Her throat tightened, but the blueprint displayed in the golden frame on the dining table left no doubt. The sharp pencil strokes, the familiar curves, and most of all, the tiny signature at the bottom, all belonged to her father. The billionaire rose slowly, brushing invisible dust from his tailored jacket. "Excuse me?" His voice was calm, but the tension underneath could split stone. Destiny swallowed hard, her knees nearly giving way. "I am sorry, sir. I didn't mean to interrupt, but that drawing is my father's work. I recognize his name." Murmurs rippled around the table. Men in suits leaned closer. Women in glittering gowns exchanged glances. A few smirked. Others narrowed their eyes with disdain. The billionaire stepped closer, looming over her like a shadow. His lips curved into a practiced smile, but his eyes were cold. "You must be mistaken. This design was developed by my company over a decade ago. It is proprietary, protected, and worth more than your entire life's earnings." Her voice trembled, but she didn't back down. "No, sir, that signature at the bottom. I grew up watching him write it. It's his." A guest stifled a laugh. Another shook his head, whispering behind a hand. The billionaire's jaw tightened. For a moment, his mask of charm cracked, and something darker flickered across his face. The Chad hurried over, his fake smile plastered on. "Is there a problem here, sir?" "There is," the billionaire replied coldly. He didn't look at the Chad. His eyes never left the trembling waitress. The young woman felt her world tilting, but deep inside, she knew one thing. She had just uncovered a truth powerful enough to shake everything. The billionaire's smile faded into a thin, icy line. He leaned closer until Destiny could see his reflection in the polished glass buttons of his suit. "You embarrass me in front of my investors and claim my legacy belongs to your father?" His voice dripped with venom, low but sharp enough for everyone to hear. The room shifted. Expensive chairs scraped the floor as guests leaned back, waiting for the drama to unfold. One woman chuckled under her breath. Another whispered, "How pathetic!" The young waitress's chest tightened. She wanted to melt into the marble tiles, to vanish before their eyes. I wasn't accusing you, sir. I just recognized his name. I swear I didn't mean silence." The word cracked through the air like a whip. The billionaire raised his hand slightly, and she flinched before he even touched her. The tray slipped from her grip, crashing on the floor with a chorus of shattering glasses. A gasp rippled through the dining hall. The Chad stormed forward, gripping her arm roughly. "Have you lost your mind?" he hissed through clenched teeth. "Do you realize who you're speaking to? This is the most important client we have." Tears stung her eyes, but she shook her head. "Please, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just know that signature. It's my father's. I'm not lying." The billionaire scoffed. "A waitress? Lecturing me on patents and invention? You should be grateful I haven't called security." He waved dismissively as though swatting a fly. "She's finished here. Fire her." The Chad nodded quickly, already tugging at her elbow. "You heard him. Collect your things. You're done." Her knees buckled. "Please, I need this job. My mother is sick. I can't lose this." "Out!" the Chad barked, pulling her toward the back. Around them, the wealthy continued their dinner as if nothing had happened. Glasses clinked, laughter returned, and the music swelled again, drowning out the sound of her muffled sobs. As the door slammed shut behind her, she pressed her back to the cold brick of the alley wall. Her hands shook, her chest heaved, and for the first time that night, she realized the depth of her mistake. She had spoken the truth, and for that, she had been crushed. The subway screeched through the dark tunnels as she sat alone, her uniform still stained with spilled wine. She clutched her purse to her chest like a lifeline. blinking back tears that refused to stop. Every rattle of the train felt like an echo of her humiliation. Faces around her blurred. No one cared to look at the black waitress who had just lost everything. By the time she reached Queens, the cold night had settled heavy on the streets. She climbed the cracked stairwell of her apartment building, the smell of damp concrete greeting her like an old enemy. Inside, the lights flickered dimly. Brianna was asleep on the worn couch, a blanket pulled to her chin, her breathing shallow from illness. On the kitchen table sat a bottle of unpaid bills, stacked like reminders of a war she was losing. Rent overdue, medical notices, final warnings. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The billionaire's sneer still echoed in her ears. "You should be grateful I haven't called security." A quiet shuffle broke her despair. Her younger brother emerged from the bedroom, rubbing his eyes, schoolbooks tucked under his arm. "Hey," he said softly, "you're late." She forced a smile, wiping her cheeks quickly. "I got stuck at work." He looked at her, suspicious but silent, before sitting down to finish his homework. His pencil scratched against the paper while she sat frozen, torn between protecting him from the truth and the weight of everything pressing on her shoulders. Her eyes drifted to the small wooden box on the top shelf. She hadn't opened it in years. Carefully, she pulled it down, brushing away the dust. Inside lay old photographs and yellowed papers. At the very bottom, folded with care, was a sketch, the same sketch she had seen framed on that billionaire's table. Her throat tightened. The strokes were unmistakable, drawn by a steady, brilliant hand. At the corner, his signature, Lamont. Her father. Memories flooded back. Late nights at the kitchen table. Him scribbling equations while she colored in the margins. His laugh, warm and booming. The way he kissed her forehead and whispered, "One day, you'll change the world too." The world had called it a suicide when he disappeared. The newspapers had mocked his breakdown. But staring at that paper now, she knew the truth. He hadn't been crazy. He had been stolen. She pressed the sketch to her chest, tears falling freely now. For years, she had believed she was powerless. But tonight, with the memory of his voice echoing in her heart, something shifted. She couldn't stay silent anymore. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. The next morning, sunlight spilled weakly through the blinds, painting pale lines across the small apartment. She hadn't slept. The sketch sat on the table. Her father's name circled again and again, as if writing it would make him alive. Brianna coughed softly in the other room, a reminder how fragile everything had become. She opened her old laptop. The screen cracked at one corner. Her fingers hovered nervously over the keys before she typed. Lamont plus invention plus missing. Most results were dust. Old obituaries, faded blogs, a handful of conspiracy threads buried beneath ads. But one headline froze her blood, the inventor who vanished and the fortune that followed. It was a 10-year-old article by a small-time blogger named Ryan. He claimed a powerful businessman had built his empire by stealing from a black engineer who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The name in the article was unmistakable. Her father's. Her pulse quickened. She clicked through every line, devouring the details, timelines, accusations, fragments of documents. Nothing fully proven, but enough to whisper that she wasn't alone. Her brother shuffled into the kitchen, yawning. "What are you reading?" She shut the laptop quickly. Just job listings. But inside, her heart hammered with a dangerous new certainty. If this Ryan was still alive, he might have answers. Hours later, she found herself standing outside a crumbling office building downtown. The sign above the door was half broken, paint peeling, letters missing. She almost turned back, but then the door creaked open. A man in his 60s, gray-bearded and tired-eyed, looked at her with quiet recognition. "You're George's daughter." Her breath caught. "You knew him?" "Not personally, but I knew what they did to him." He motioned her inside, the room filled with stacks of yellowed newspapers and dusty folders. "Your father was brilliant, and brilliance scares men with power. I tried to publish the truth, but they silenced me." She stepped closer, desperate. Then help me, please. They fired me last night because I recognize his work. I can't let them erase him again. Ryan studied her for a long moment, then pulled a folder from a locked drawer. Inside were copies of letters, old patent drafts, scraps of evidence he had gathered before threats drove him underground. If you want to do this, understand, once you start digging, they'll come after you too. Her hands trembled as she held the papers. They already have. And for the first time, her fear began to harden into resolve. That night, she sat at her desk with Ryan's folder spread open before her. Pages of sketches, letters, and half-burnt documents whispered stories no one had dared to believe. Every line carried her father's hand, his genius captured in ink, and stolen by the man who humiliated her just hours ago. Ryan paced the room slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Most of this is circumstantial, strong enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough to bring him down. She clenched her fists. Then what will be enough? Ryan's eyes hardened. The original patent application. If we can find it, the world will know your father filed it first. Her pulse spiked. Where? He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Federal Records Archive. Buried in their basement. I know a clerk who owes me a favor. If the papers still exist, that's where they'll be. Hours later, she walked with Ryan through the dim corridors of the archive building. The hum of fluorescent lights buzz above. The smell of dust and ink thick in the air. A nervous man in a wrinkled shirt led them down to a locked room. I shouldn't be doing this, he muttered, fumbling with his keys. Inside, rows of steel cabinets stretched like soldiers in the dark. Ryan moved quickly, scanning the labels until his hand froze. Here, he pulled out a folder stamped with a date just weeks before her father vanished. Her breath caught as she opened it. There was the same turbine design, every line identical to the blueprint the billionaire had displayed, but at the bottom glowed the truth. Lamont, signed, dated, notarized. Her knees nearly gave way. This proves it. Ryan nodded grimly, snapping photos of every page with a burner phone. We can't take the originals, but this is enough to start. But as she traced her father's signature with trembling fingers, a cold chill prickled her skin. Her phone buzzed. A new message appeared on the cracked screen. Stop digging or you'll end up like him. Her blood ran cold. She glanced toward the hallway, suddenly aware of the echo of footsteps that weren't theirs. Ryan grabbed her arm. We have to go. Now. They shoved the folder back, locked the cabinet, and slipped out through the service door. The city air hit her face, sharp and freezing. She clutched the photo proof against her chest, her heart hammering. For the first time, she knew the truth, and for the first time, she realized just how dangerous it was. The following morning, she sat with Ryan in his dusty office, the patent photos spread across the desk. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what they held. Her father's signature, undeniable proof. Ryan lit a cigarette, his voice steady. We take this public, and there's no going back. Once his name is out there, he'll fight like an animal. She swallowed hard. Let him. He's stolen enough. By noon, Ryan's contact at a mid-sized investigative outlet had the files. The first article dropped quietly online. Did a billionaire steal a black inventor's legacy? It wasn't polished, but it was enough to ignite sparks. Within hours, tweets multiplied, hashtags trended, and strangers across the country began asking questions. At her apartment, she scrolled through comments. This is unbelievable. Justice for George Williams. Expose the thief. Tears pricked her eyes. For the first time, her father's name wasn't buried in silence. People were speaking it, but with exposure came retaliation. That same evening, a news anchor read a statement live. Mr. Mason categorically denies these baseless accusations. The so-called blueprint was a collaborative design created under his company's supervision more than a decade ago. These claims, made by a disgruntled waitress, are nothing more than desperate lies. She froze at the word waitress. He hadn't even used her name, just reduced her to a uniform, stripping her of identity. The smear campaign rolled in fast. Anonymous blogs called her unstable. Old photos from social media surfaced, twisted into ugly narratives. Neighbors whispered in the stairwell. Even Jalen came home from school quiet, his eyes downcast. They said, "You're making things up," he murmured. Her chest ached, but she held his hands firmly. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs courage. Ryan slammed a stack of papers onto the desk. This is exactly how he wins. Intimidation, gaslighting, power plays. But the louder he shouts, the more people will start asking why. That night, as rain battered the city, she sat by her window. Across the street, a dark sedan idled too long. Its tinted windows reflected only shadows. Her phone buzzed again. Last warning. Stop now. Her jaw tightened. She whispered her father's photo taped above her desk. They think fear will silence me, but they don't know whose blood runs in my veins. Outside, the car finally drove off into the storm. She knew the battle had only just begun. Sunday morning arrived with a storm of headlines. Stolen genius. Black inventors were exposed as billionaire's fortune. The article spread like wildfire, carried by major outlets, retweeted by activists, and dissected on talk shows. Her father's name was everywhere, not as a forgotten footnote, but as the rightful mind behind the turbine design. From the safety of Ryan's cramped office, she watched the news in stunned silence. Protesters had gathered outside Mason Tower, holding signs. Truth has a name, Justice for George. For the first time in over a decade, her father's story was no longer buried. The billionaire appeared on television that evening, his face carefully composed, his words dripping with false sincerity. "I'm mourn the tragedy of a troubled man," he said, "but these accusations are nothing but attempts to tarnish my reputation." But the world wasn't buying it anymore. Reporters confronted him with the leaked patent photos. A witness stepped forward. Lawyers announced a federal inquiry. His empire, once untouchable, now trembled under the weight of truth. She stood at the window, phone buzzing endlessly with messages of support. Her brother burst into the room, waving his tablet. "Look, they're saying Dad's name on CNN." His smile was wide, his eyes shining with pride. Her throat tightened. She pulled him close, tears wetting his hair. He deserves this. He was never weak. He was never forgotten. Later that night, she visited Brianna's room. The older woman's eyes fluttered open, weary but glowing. "Your father would be proud," she whispered. "You carried his voice back into the world." She knelt beside the bed, clutching Brianna's hand. "No, Mama, we carried it." Outside, sirens echoed faintly, the city buzzing with change. She knew the fight wasn't over. Powerful men rarely surrender without dragging others down. But tonight, for the first time, she felt the balance shift. She pulled the folded sketch from her purse, smoothing the creases gently. Her father's signature stared back at her, steady and unbroken, whispering to the paper. She smiled through her tears. "They tried to erase you, Dad, but now the world knows. You live again in every truth we speak." The night closed around her, quiet and calm. Not an ending, but a beginning. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.